In the heart of the Alaskan wilderness, an elderly woman living in solitude stumbled upon a life-changing scene. She never imagined that her quiet days would be interrupted by the cries of 3 grizzly bear cubs struggling during birth. But what she discovered among them didn't just touch her heart, it shocked the entire world. Get ready for a story of courage, unexpected bonds, and a revelation so profound it will leave you breathless. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. Eleanor Shaw had spent her twilight years nestled in a secluded cabin deep in the Alaskan wilderness. The towering pines and the distant call of wolves were her only companions. Having lost her husband 5 years prior, Eleanor found solace in the predictable rhythm of her solitary life. She tended her garden, read old novels by the fire, and took long walks through the snow-blanketed forest. But one crisp morning in early spring, as the snow began to melt and reveal the earth beneath, Eleanor heard something that shattered her routine, the faint, desperate cries of an animal. Following the sound through the dense forest, her heart pounded with curiosity and concern. As she neared a thicket, she froze. Before her lay a massive grizzly bear, clearly in distress. The bear was in the throes of labor, but something was wrong. The cubs were struggling, tangled in the remnants of a hunter's snare that had wrapped around their mother's leg. The mother bear's strength was fading fast, and the cubs were barely moving. Eleanor knew the risks. Approaching a grizzly, especially a mother, was a death sentence. But as she watched the life drain from the bear's eyes, something inside her stirred. She couldn't walk away. Gathering all her courage, she stepped forward. With trembling hands, Eleanor spoke softly to the bear, her voice gentle and soothing. The bear, exhausted and in pain, didn't resist. Eleanor carefully cut the snare, freeing the bear's leg, and then turned her attention to the cubs. One by one, she helped them into the world, her heart breaking at their fragile, struggling forms. But it wasn't until she cradled the 3rd cub that she noticed something peculiar, a small, distinct birthmark on its chest, shaped eerily like a heart. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She felt an inexplicable connection to the tiny creature, as if fate had intertwined their paths for a reason. As the mother bear's breathing grew shallow, she nuzzled her cubs one last time before slipping into eternal rest. Eleanor, with tears streaming down her face, gathered the orphaned cubs into her arms and made the long, arduous journey back to her cabin. She had no idea that this act of compassion would spark a chain of events that would touch lives far beyond the forest. Back in the warmth of her cabin, Eleanor carefully laid the cubs near the hearth, where the fire's gentle glow cast flickering shadows across the wooden walls. She worked quickly, wrapping them in thick blankets and warming bottles of milk to feed them. The cubs, weak but alive, responded to her care with faint, grateful murmurs. Over the next few days, Eleanor's life transformed. Her days, once filled with solitude, were now occupied by feeding, cleaning, and tending to the cubs. She named them Hope, Brave, and Heart for the tiny heart-shaped birthmark on the 3rd cub's chest. Hope was the most curious, always crawling toward the windows to peer outside. Brave was the strongest, already attempting to stand on shaky legs. But Heart was different. There was a calm, almost knowing look in his eyes, as if he understood more than a bear cub should. The bond between Eleanor and the cubs deepened with each passing day. The cabin, once silent and still, was now alive with the sounds of playful growls and soft, contented snores. Eleanor felt a warmth in her heart she hadn't known since her husband passed away. But the outside world would not remain oblivious to her unusual family for long. One morning, as Eleanor prepared breakfast, she heard a sharp knock at the door. Startled, she opened it to find a park ranger standing on her porch, his eyes wide with disbelief as he glanced over her shoulder at the cubs nestled by the fire. "Ma'am, are you aware those are grizzly cubs?" he asked, his voice a mix of concern and astonishment. Eleanor nodded, explaining the events that had led to this unlikely situation. The ranger listened intently, his expression softening as she spoke, but when she finished, he shook his head slowly. "It's illegal to keep wild animals, especially grizzlies. They belong in the wild." Eleanor's heart sank. She knew he was right, but the thought of losing the cubs felt unbearable. "They won't survive without me," she whispered, her voice trembling. The ranger hesitated, clearly torn. "I'll have to report this," he said finally. "But I'll give you a few days to figure something out." As he left, Eleanor felt a surge of determination. She wouldn't give up on the cubs without a fight. She began researching wildlife rehabilitation centers, hoping to find a place where they could be safe. But nothing felt right. These cubs weren't just wild animals, they were her family. That night, as she sat by the fire with the cubs curled against her, Eleanor felt a sense of foreboding. She knew the ranger would return, and this time, he wouldn't leave without the cubs. But Eleanor was ready to do whatever it took to protect them. Eleanor woke early the next morning, the weight of the ranger's visit still heavy on her mind. The cubs were still asleep, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each breath. She knew time was running out. If she wanted to keep them safe, she had to act quickly. She called the nearest wildlife sanctuary, explaining her situation. The woman on the other end of the line was sympathetic but firm. "Grizzly cubs need to be in the wild, or at the very least, in a controlled sanctuary. Keeping them could be dangerous for both you and them." Eleanor's heart ached. She understood their point, but the thought of handing over the cubs to strangers felt like a betrayal. She needed another solution. Determined, she drove into town for the first time in weeks, hoping to find legal counsel. She spoke to a lawyer who explained the complexities of wildlife laws in Alaska. "Your best chance is to prove that the cubs can't survive without you," he said. "But that's going to be difficult." Feeling defeated but not ready to give up, Eleanor returned home. That evening, as she sat by the fire, she noticed something strange. Hart, the cub with the birthmark, was acting differently. He was more alert, his eyes following her every move with an intensity that seemed almost human. Over the next few days, Eleanor observed the cubs closely. Hope and Brave were adapting quickly, their wild instincts taking over. But Hart seemed to rely on her in ways that went beyond survival. It was as if he understood her, shared her pain and fears. One night, Eleanor had a dream. In it, her late husband appeared, standing at the edge of the forest with Hart by his side. "They're meant to be with you," he whispered. "But you have to fight for them." The next morning, Eleanor knew what she had to do. She would go public with her story. She contacted a local journalist, who agreed to visit and document her unique situation. When the article was published, it spread like wildfire. People from all over the world were touched by Eleanor's story, flooding social media with support. But with the attention came scrutiny. Wildlife officials announced they would be visiting Eleanor's cabin to assess the situation. Eleanor braced herself for the battle ahead, knowing that the fight to keep the cubs was far from over. The media frenzy that followed the publication of Eleanor's story was unlike anything she had ever experienced. News vans lined the narrow road leading to her cabin, and reporters camped outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman who had defied the odds to save 3 grizzly bear cubs. Eleanor felt overwhelmed but also empowered. The outpouring of support from people around the world gave her strength. Letters, emails, and phone calls flooded in, each one sharing a story of how Eleanor's courage had inspired them. But not everyone was supportive. Wildlife officials and environmentalists voiced concerns about the dangers of domesticated wild animals. They argued that keeping the cubs would set a dangerous precedent and could lead to unforeseen consequences. Eleanor knew they had a point, but she also knew that these cubs were different. They weren't just wild animals, they were family. She resolved to fight for them, no matter the cost. As the day of the officials' visit approached, Eleanor prepared her home and her heart. She documented every moment with the cubs, capturing their growth, their bond, and the undeniable connection they shared. She hoped that by showing the world the love they had for each other, she could make them see what she saw. When the officials finally arrived, Eleanor greeted them with a mix of anxiety and determination. She led them through her cabin, showing them the cubs' living conditions, their routines, and the depth of their bond. The officials listened and observed, taking notes and asking questions. Eleanor answered each one honestly, her voice steady and unwavering. After what felt like hours, the lead official, a stern man named Daniel, turned to Eleanor. "We'll need time to review everything," he said. "But I can't promise the outcome you're hoping for." Eleanor nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. But as the officials left, she felt a glimmer of hope. She had done everything she could. Now it was in their hands, and the hands of the people who had rallied behind her. The next few days were a blur of anticipation and anxiety. Eleanor continued to care for the cubs, cherishing every moment as if it might be their last together. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eleanor received a phone call. It was Daniel. "We've made our decision," he said. "And you might want to sit down." Eleanor gripped the phone tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. Daniel's voice on the other end was steady but unreadable. "We've reviewed all the evidence," he began, pausing for what felt like an eternity. "The bond you've formed with these cubs is extraordinary, but it's unprecedented. There's no legal framework for a situation like this." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She braced herself for the worst. However, Daniel continued. "The public outcry and the overwhelming support for your story have made it impossible to ignore. We've decided to make an exception." Eleanor's knees buckled, and she sank into her chair. "An exception," she whispered. "You will be granted a special permit to care for the cubs," Daniel explained. "But there will be conditions, regular check-ins from wildlife officials, and you'll need to work with a biologist to ensure their health and safety." Tears welled up in Eleanor's eyes. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice breaking. As she hung up the phone, Eleanor felt a wave of relief and joy wash over her. She turned to the cubs, who were playing by the fire, oblivious to the life-changing news. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, pulling them close. The days that followed were filled with a renewed sense of purpose. Eleanor welcomed the biologist, Dr. Sarah Collins, into her home. Sarah was young and enthusiastic, with a deep love for wildlife. She quickly bonded with Eleanor and the cubs, offering invaluable advice on how to care for them properly. With Sarah's guidance, Eleanor learned to balance the cubs' need for both affection and the skills they'd need if they were ever to return to the wild. They built climbing structures in the yard, and Sarah taught Eleanor how to encourage the cub's natural foraging instincts. But Hart continued to stand out. His connection with Eleanor grew deeper by the day. He followed her everywhere, his eyes reflecting a wisdom that was both comforting and mysterious. As the months passed, the story of Eleanor and the cubs became a symbol of hope and resilience. People from around the world sent letters and donations, and a documentary crew even arrived to capture their journey on film. Yet not all attention was welcome. Some critics argued that Eleanor was interfering with nature, that the cubs would never truly belong in either world, the wild or domestic life. Eleanor understood their concerns but knew in her heart that her bond with the cubs was something special, something that transcended the ordinary. One day, while filming for the documentary, something unexpected happened. Hart wandered off into the forest, something he'd never done before without Eleanor. Panic surged through her, and she, along with Sarah and the crew, set out to find him. After hours of searching, they found Hart at the edge of a clearing, standing still, staring into the distance. As Eleanor approached, she saw what had captured his attention, a group of wild grizzlies in the distance. Hart turned back to Eleanor, his eyes filled with an unspoken message. It was as if he was torn between two worlds, the wild, where he belonged, and the human who had become his family. Eleanor's heart ached with the realization that one day Hart might choose to leave. But she knew that true love meant letting go when the time was right. That night, as they sat by the fire, Eleanor whispered to Hart, "Whatever you choose, know that you'll always have a place here with me." The future was uncertain, but for now, they had each other, and that was enough. Winter crept in with an unforgiving chill, blanketing Eleanor's cabin and the surrounding forest in thick layers of snow. The cold seeped into every crevice, yet inside the cabin, warmth radiated from the hearth. A warmth born not just of fire but of the bond between Eleanor and her cubs. Hart, however, had grown restless since his encounter with the wild grizzlies. He often stood by the window, staring into the woods, his ears twitching at every distant sound. Eleanor noticed the change, a silent pull that tugged at his spirit, but she said nothing, afraid that acknowledging it might hasten his departure. One evening, as a fierce blizzard began to brew, Sarah arrived earlier than usual for her check-in. She brought news that sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. "There have been reports of poachers in the area," Sarah said, her face grave. "They're after rare pelts, and with the cubs growing bigger, they could become targets." Eleanor felt a surge of protectiveness. "They'll have to go through me first," she declared. But as the storm outside raged on, a different kind of turmoil brewed inside. That night, Hart didn't return from his usual wanderings near the edge of the forest. Eleanor waited, her heart pounding louder with each hour that passed. By dawn, panic had taken hold. Ignoring Sarah's protests, Eleanor bundled up and plunged into the blizzard. The forest was a white labyrinth, every tree and shadow cloaked in snow. She called for Hart, her voice swallowed by the wind. Hours passed. Just as despair began to seep into her bones, Eleanor stumbled upon fresh tracks, bare tracks alongside boot prints. Fear surged through her veins. Following the trail, Eleanor found a clearing where the snow was disturbed, signs of a struggle evident. Her heart sank. But then, a faint growl echoed through the trees. Eleanor pushed forward, her determination unwavering. She found Hart trapped in a crude snare, his powerful body straining against the ropes. Nearby, two poachers were arguing, their voices muffled by the storm. Without thinking, Eleanor picked up a heavy branch and charged. The poachers turned, shocked at the sight of an elderly woman wielding such fury. Before they could react, Eleanor swung the branch with all her might, striking one of them down. Hart, sensing his moment, thrashed violently and broke free, his roars echoing through the forest. The remaining poacher fled, leaving his partner unconscious in the snow. Hart limped toward Eleanor, nuzzling her face with a soft, grateful rumble. Tears froze on her cheeks as she wrapped her arms around his massive neck. Together, they made their way back to the cabin, where Sarah was waiting with a first aid kit and a call already placed to the local authorities. The police arrived soon after, taking the unconscious poacher into custody and promising to track down his partner. That night, as Hart lay by the fire, his wounds cleaned and bandaged, Eleanor sat beside him, her hand resting on his thick fur. The storm outside had calmed, but inside, Eleanor felt a new storm. The realization that Hart's heart belonged to the wild as much as it belonged to her. Sarah, sensing Eleanor's turmoil, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He knows where home is," she whispered. But Eleanor knew the truth. Love meant letting go, even if it tore you apart. The next morning, Eleanor woke to find Hart standing at the edge of the forest, looking back at her one last time. Their eyes met, a silent goodbye passing between them. Then, with a final lingering glance, Hart disappeared into the trees. Eleanor stood there for a long time, the cold biting at her skin, her heart aching with both loss and pride. She had saved him, and now he was free. But deep down, she knew he would always carry a piece of her with him, just as she would carry him in her heart forever. Months passed since Hart's departure, and Eleanor's life settled into a quiet rhythm. The remaining cubs, now strong and independent, prepared for their own journey into the wild. The cabin felt emptier, but Eleanor found solace in knowing she had given them the best chance at life. Spring brought new life to the forest, and with it, new visitors. The documentary about Eleanor and her cubs had aired, capturing the hearts of people around the world. Tourists and animal lovers flocked to the small town nearby, eager to catch a glimpse of the woman who had risked everything for 3 orphaned grizzly cubs. Eleanor welcomed them with warmth, sharing her story and the lessons she had learned. She spoke of courage, compassion, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and nature. Her tale became a beacon of hope, inspiring others to act with kindness and bravery. One day, as Eleanor tended to her garden, Sarah arrived with an envelope in hand. "You've been invited to speak at the National Wildlife Conservation Conference," she announced, her eyes gleaming with pride. Eleanor hesitated. Public speaking was never her forte, but Sarah's encouraging smile and the thought of honoring Hart's legacy gave her the courage to accept. The conference was held in a grand hall, filled with conservationists, scientists, and nature enthusiasts from around the world. Eleanor stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding in her chest. As she spoke, she shared not just her story but the emotional journey that had transformed her life. "Hart taught me that love knows no boundaries," she said, her voice steady. "He showed me that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let go, trusting that the bonds we've formed will endure, no matter the distance." The audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation, their applause echoing through the hall. Eleanor felt warmth in her heart, knowing that Hart's story had touched so many lives. Upon returning home, Eleanor found herself surrounded by letters and gifts from people moved by her journey. Children sent drawings of bears, and adults shared stories of how they had been inspired to protect wildlife in their own communities. One evening, as Eleanor sat by the fire, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the forest. Her heart skipped a beat. It was Hart. Standing tall and proud, his golden eyes shone in the twilight. He wasn't alone, by his side were two cubs of his own. Tears welled up in Eleanor's eyes as she stepped outside. Hart approached slowly, his cubs following closely. They stood face to face, a silent understanding passing between them. Hart had found his place in the wild, but he hadn't forgotten the woman who had saved him. For a moment, time stood still. Then, with a gentle nudge, Hart led his cubs back into the forest, disappearing into the trees. Eleanor watched them go, her heart full of both sorrow and joy. She knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was a new beginning, a legacy of love and courage that would live on in the hearts of all who heard it. Eleanor turned back to her cabin, the warmth of the fire waiting for her inside. She smiled, knowing that Hart would always be a part of her and that their story would continue to inspire generations to come. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Share it with someone who loves inspiring stories and help us spread messages of courage and hope. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey.